So, John, if we've been led to believe June 15 is something of a tennis D-Day where there's supposed to be decisions made on what's left of the hardcourt season and eventually U.S. Open, where do you think we stand right
I feel like we need to timestamp this because this could all be obsolete by the time this runs. But as of now, we're on, and there will be a U.S. Open. It won't look anything like the U.S. Open we're accustomed to. It'll be very interesting to see what the field looks like. It'll be interesting to see. We don't think there will be juniors and wheelchair and qualifying. There will probably be very pared down doubles, but I think the question is going to very quickly, assuming this is a go and this gets government approval, the question is going to pivot to who's in and who's out. And if the top four men's players don't show up, what does it mean for the heft of the title? I mean, I'm interested. What do you think? I mean, what do you do this event if this has the field of a run-of-the-mill 500 level event?
John, I haven't changed on that view since March 15th, when this shutdown first started. I think it's just vital that there be competition. And look, the U.S. Open can't force people to come and play. But I personally think way more people will play than not. I think the upper crust is what we're all concerned about, right? Is the upper crust going to play under what will be necessary restrictions and looming the French Open right behind the U.S. Open, right? Where the European players don't have the travel issues. But man, I just think it's so vital for us to have something back. And it's jobs, it's work, and I've read something last week that just rubbed me the wrong way, and helped me if I'm taking this the wrong way. There was a quote, and I think it may have been in the New York Times. Chris Clary may have written it, but Donna Vekic, who's a fairly highly ranked player right now on the WTA tour, was asked about playing the U.S. Open under these conditions that would include limited entourage. And her quote was, in essence, that's a non-starter. And I cringed. How self-centered.
Not a Beckett needs their traveling party.
But how self-centered can you be to think that way in this extraordinary time when, as we all know, that if you're player number 65 in the world and you're automatically in the Open, and you go, and if you win one match, you probably walk away, even if you lose second round, probably $100,000 or close to it.
Right.
And how essential that funds you for a year, doesn't it?
If you, I'm hearing 95% of the prize money of last year, even though the USTA is going to lose more than half the revenue. I mean, there won't make $1 on ticket sales. I mean, that's whatever, you look at the finance, $150 million you're not going to have access to. I did not see that quote from Donna Vekic, the Donna party, as it were. But don't you think, fine for her. I mean, so the draw cutoff will go down, and somebody's going to be the player who's ranked 127, who would have missed, 129, who would have missed qualifying. Fine for me. I get players not wanting to travel and go on airplanes and cross oceans. I mean, it's very different for Donna Vekic from Croatia or Rafa from Mallorca versus, if John Isner wants to get on a 90-minute flight. I get players not wanting to stay at the hotel, and they have families and they're not sure about how often they're going to be tested and their health concerns. I don't get how not bringing your entourage into the facility. I mean, in theory, they could still be at the hotel, as I understand it. I saw Dan Evans saying, hell, if I have to share a physio, I'll share a physio. No problem there. But, I mean, it's kind of the beauty of tennis, right? Players make their own decision, and if Donna Vekic has the luxury of thumbing her nose at $100,000 because she doesn't want to only have one person in her membrane, someone else will happily take her spot in the draw. And to your point, I mean, keep in mind these players, they haven't made any money. I mean, no one's made a dime of prize money apart from these sort of unsanctioned events since late February, early March. The good news is they haven't spent any money in expenses. Some of them probably have had to make contractually, they've had to pay coaches, but they haven't had travel costs. They haven't had to restring rackets. $100,000 that kind of salvages the year for a lot of players. I mean, they're one match at a major in front of no fans, and you win 2 sets if you're a woman and 3 sets if you're a man, and this disastrous 2020 has been salvaged that afternoon. I think for a lot of players, that's a very appealing proposition.
Yeah, John, I could not agree more. And I think we're going to face this in all sport coming back in the United States. I think, for example, in college football, I think there will be people, families who will say, I'm just not comfortable with my son playing football this year. I'm not comfortable with my child going to campus until there's a vaccine. I think we're going to see that out of a huge pool of people. I think it's inevitable you will have some of that. So take it back to what we're talking about. If the top 100, if there are 5 or 10 players that decide I'm not comfortable, that's fine. I would keep that to themselves. Don't use this I can't come without my 5 people stuff. That just sounds so terrible right now.
Yeah, I think it's going to be way more than 5 or 10 of the top 100.
Yeah.
And I think, I think some of this is strategic, right? I mean, why is Rafa going to fly across an ocean? He's suddenly got to play best of 5 on hard courts, which has not always been so great to his body, with a French Open, presumably 3 weeks down the road. I mean, if I were advising him, I would say, don't you dare go play the U.S. Open. Roger has 4 kids. Novak has already expressed his views on communicable diseases. I've heard that, if you're Stan Wawrinka, if you're Marin Cilic, do you really play this event? I think there will be players, in that 30 to 70 range who just aren't comfortable. I would hate to guess, but I think there will be some, a lot of times they say you get these press releases this time of year saying, whatever, all 102 eligible players have entered the U.S. Open. Maybe someone's got knee surgery. Juan Martín del Potro is the one player in the top 100 who has not put his name in the hat. I think we're going to have I think that draw cutoff is going to go much deeper this year. Keep in mind that there's no qualifying. So somebody's last minute you talk about, let's use that $100,000 figure. I'm making up names here, but if Marin Cilic decides at the last moment, it's not for me, that very next guy, that's a lucky loser for you. I mean, the guy who's number 137 as opposed to 138 suddenly is made $50,000. So I think it's going to be very interesting.
Yeah, and there's two other elements, John, that I think play into this. So let's take them in order. One is Cincinnati, the concept of moving Cincinnati, which the USTA owns, to play it, which now turns, if you are a top player and you want to play both, the prospect of having to spend a month in a hotel in New York. I got to believe that's a deterrent.
An airport hotel too, from what Djokovic says. I'd heard the same thing, that they're not keen on everyone going to Manhattan. So presumably you're at a hotel at JFK. That's a little different than spending a month at the St. Regis off Central Park. Again, I think for some players, I mean, like Dan Evans was a name I saw who's been very outspoken. So I'll play tomorrow if I have to. Mm-hmm. Dan Evans' priorities and probably his financial calculus is very different from, never mind Rafa, Roger, Novak. It's very different from Stan Wawrinka and Cilic. So, yeah.
And John, the other thing that I've noticed watching the news, both BBC and French network news, which I've been watching most nights in my home recently, the reaction of the rest of the world to what has gone on in our country over the last 2 weeks, it jars me how I'm seeing it presented, the number of protests we've seen around the world over what's happening here. And as someone who was a child but lived through 1968, didn't happen. The reaction around the world wasn't this way. I have to wonder again how much that, when the rest of the world sees what's happening right now in our cities and our streets, if the vision of America right now is impacting some of this.
Which way does that cut? Good or bad?
No, I worry that it's again a deterrent. That if you're sitting in a European country right now and you're looking at what's happening in our cities, vastly peaceful, we understand, but yes, there has been some destruction. That's a deterrent.
That's interesting. I mean, I don't know what the media coverage has been overseas. I mean, I would like to think some people might see this and say, look, these are mixed race crowds that are protesting peacefully, and they finally had enough. And whether it's police brutality or this monstrous president, these people are finally said enough is enough. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I could see that cutting the other way though.
Okay.
And players from overseas saying, you know, I want to be part of this, and I want to be part of this this collective voice. And I think tennis players, for the most part, distinguished themselves last week in sort of these spasms of activism. I think the vibe is going to be really interesting in general. I mean, there's a lot going on. Part of this is, you know, we've had this cratered schedule. We're playing again. Everyone's going to be in the same facility, the same hotel, in this bubble, in this airport. Imagine the bar scene at this airport hotel. Nobody's competed. There's been all this social media interaction. People are uncertain about their jobs, about the state of the planet. I mean, I think it's going to be a really interesting vibe when tennis finally resumes again, for all this reason. I mean, for everything from George Floyd to COVID to everybody not be. I mean, these are athletes. I mean, you and I could talk on Zoom and still do some semblance of our job. If you're defining yourself by hitting a tennis ball and setting goals and wins and losses and ranking points, and suddenly you've got none of that. I think for a lot of these players, these last 4 or 5 months have been real kind of exercises in self-assessment. I mean, if I'm not competing, what am I? And I think it's something everyone's sort of talking about who's going to be in shape and who's going to have a beer gut and who's getting the reps. I think a lot of players are going through a lot psychologically right now. And when tennis gets back and everybody can see each other and the workforce is back to normal and you're competing, but they're not going to be fans. I mean, it's got to be a crazy experience for these players when they finally can resume again.
Yeah. The no fan is another fascinating topic to me. And the fact I heard Petra Kvitova was on Tennis Channel earlier this week saying how she had played some special event one-off and it was so bizarre. That's one that, because we see so much of the regular tour of tennis and in other sports that I've covered, you've covered, as I laugh, I say, I did baseball games in Cleveland, many of them in old Cleveland. And I did baseball games in Montreal. I've seen games with no fans. And you don't like it. It's not the preferred, but you survive because the athletes are still the best at what they do. So I've wondered about that. The concept I've heard again of I don't want to play with no fans. Nobody wants to,
right.
And no one's suggesting this is the 5-year plan. But to get back in a reopen, to use the phrase, I sense that one to me doesn't register.
It's funny too, because how often do you say? How often have we heard players, not just tennis athletes? I wasn't paying attention. I just played the ball. I blocked that out. I think the fans, it's an interesting component, but I think there's all sorts of other stuff. I mean, just the whole gestalt of an event, right? And it's someone scanning your bag, and it's people want a selfie, and it's courtesy cars, it's data. I mean, I don't know what they're going to do in theory, there'll be someone in the umpire's chair, but there won't be anyone on the lines. When Tennis Channel did those matches in West Palm Beach, you literally use Roman numerals to keep track of aces. But I think you're right. I mean, I think for the first 10 minutes, it's going to be really weird. And I hit a winner and nobody said anything. All I heard was my coach clapping. But I got to think that you get used to a lot. Athletes are used to adjusting and compartmentalizing. I got to think that by 2-2 in the first set, you've made your adjustments and you're back to playing a match, and you've told yourself, rightly so, that this is a first round match at a major is a first round match at a major. So again, I want rights to the documentary on tennis coming back.
You posited a great, called it game theory on your Twitter feed, John, which I thought was phenomenal. Applying this, that basically you have 3 top men, Euros, this potential of playing the Open in New York with 2 weeks later, Roland Garros.
Right, right.
And 2019 and 17, all of that converging, does that influence any, and now throw in the added wrinkle that Severin Luthi leaks out that perhaps Rogers' recovery from his recent knee fix
Right.
isn't as smooth as they'd like it to be. I
Right.
thought I hadn't thought that way yet. If two don't go, does one then go to say that helps me
Exactly.
in
What do you think?
well, I don't think it'd be Roger personally. I mean, I don't think Roger would be the one of the three. In other words, if
Right.
Novak and Rafa both say no, I don't think Roger would be the one. The one I wonder about is Novak.
Yeah,
Interestingly enough, as much as he has been open about this whole vaccine issue, and just that's the one. That's the one. How do you feel?
So I'll throw a funny one at you. I had this discussion with a former player who will remain nameless. No, I mean, you're right. It's like, there are the three gas stations by the airport, and they all decide to charge $3 per gallon. If one of them charges $2.99, they suddenly there's a great incentive to break the cartel.
Yeah, right.
But I was talking about this with a former player, and I said, the one reason, I mean, I think you're right. If Rafa clearly has intimated he does not want to go, the French Open's coming, it doesn't make much sense. And same with Roger, who, bear in mind, Roger hasn't won the U.S. Open since 2008. He has a finite number of majors left. He literally could take a train from Basel to Paris in 3 weeks. You don't get the feeling with 4 kids and health concerns, you don't get the feeling he's playing. So I said, Novak is the obvious one to sort of go and pick up, try and pick up a major without the other two guys in the field. And I said, the one reason I think he might not do it is because perception, and I think this is to his credit, perception means so much to him. It wouldn't go over well with the fans. People would say it's diluted. People would say, oh, he may have retired with the most majors, but remember when Rafa and Roger were responsible and didn't play the COVID Open and Novak at the last. And the former player said, yes, but remember, there will be no fans there. So Novak doesn't have to worry about getting booed or worried about the fans being 95-5 for his opponent, as we've seen at other majors. So it really is kind of an interesting thought exercise. I also wonder, let's work on the assumption. I think it's a safe assumption. In a perfect world, Roger, Rafa, and Novak don't want to play this event. They don't want to cross an ocean. They don't want the health risk. But how do the three of them feel when, Grigor Dimitrov breaks through and finally punctures the big three? I mean, they may not want to go, but how will they feel when Daniil Medvedev wins a major and they have to watch the trophy ceremony? They have to, those three have won every major since Barack Obama was president. Since Stan won in 2016, it's got to be a little weird for the three of them to be home and sit there when Grigor Dimitrov thanks his team and talks about how he was so happy to get through 7 tough matches. So it's really interesting, isn't it? And Serena's different, but she also has a big decision to make.
That's where I was going to go next, John, is on the other side. If a fair number of contenders on the women's side decide not to travel, and Serena has had still chasing that elusive last one, does that help her path?
I think Serena cuts both ways too. Like Serena's not worried about getting the middle seat on Delta, right? I mean, Serena's got a 90-minute net jets. At the same time, I'm struggling. I mean, I think the team and this limit on entourage. It's been a long time since Serena's played an event with only one person in her entourage. She is, a wife and a mother and has a family, and there have been health concerns in that family. Is Serena Williams going to stay at the the airport Ramada Inn for more than 2 weeks? I think a lot of these top players are really going to they all have a different calculus to make, but a lot of them have reasons to play, and a lot of them have reasons to sit this one out. It's going to be really interesting.
The lodging question in New York, for example, John, I wonder, because we're, obviously our work on Tennis Channel, we're all facing the possibility of going to Paris because we it certainly appears that Roland Garros is going to be played, where France stands right now coming out of its lockdown seems to be in a pretty good place. Whether we can go or not is a different story. And that's going to be a governmental decision. So isn't that going to be the same case at the U.S. Open when you think this is going to be New York City and New York State that would make a lot of these decisions and not the USTA?
And the USTA, for a variety of reasons, I think my least favorite word, optics, nonprofit status. These are not good times to be trading in privilege. I don't think the U.S. Open is going to act inconsistently with government. The flip side is I can't imagine they're not getting positive signs given where we are. I mean, the first whiff of Mayor de Blasio or Governor Cuomo saying, you know what, let's see in 2021, and I suspect they would not fight that. So my guess is they're getting very positive conversations with government, or we wouldn't be having this conversation on June, whatever it is, June 9th. Yeah. But
John, I would guess that if the lodging point I was going to make was that if Serena, for example, wanted to stay in a private residence on the North Shore of Long Island, as long as she's willing to be tested, however many times you have to be tested, at some point I would think that the government is going to make that call, say, okay, that's as long as you get tested before you come onto the grounds.
It's a great question. And remember, I mean, tennis doesn't have a union. This would be something that in any other sport would be collectively bargained, or there would be some sort of understanding. I'm not even sure. I mean, I've been told the USTA is in the clear here, but can an event unilaterally withdraw a player for health reasons? What if a player says, you know what, I don't think so. This must be a false positive. I feel fine. I want to play tomorrow. Usually it's the other way around. Usually the tournament is hopeful that the players compete. The USTA has, I've been told they have assurances that they do have this power to unilaterally broom players out who may have failed a test. I don't know if that would stand up. I mean, I would need to see the language on that. And does the USTA, do they have a right to say, listen, we're the tournament, we're cutting the prize money here, and we need every player to be in. I mean, I've heard this airport hotel, you're not going to be able to leave to go buy toothpaste. I mean, I've heard this is going to be real. I can't remember the term that Djokovic used, but he wasn't kidding when he said, strict procedures, or, I mean, he had an adjective that he threw out there that actually sounded very accurate. I've heard these are going to be real lockdown type conditions. If you need mouthwash, someone will get it for you, but you ain't leaving that hotel. So, it'll be very interesting. I mean, why doesn't, Serena might say, listen, it's my lucky suite and I have my routine and we have the right massage table at my suite at the Four Seasons. I ain't staying at no airport Ramada Inn. I wonder if the tournament can enforce that.
Yeah, that's a great call. And I hadn't heard that detail, John. As you said that, I'm thinking, because I know this for a fact, for example, an American airline captain flew a flight last week to Paris for one of the American airlines. And the layover was 48 hours. And he was forced to stay in a hotel near Charles de Gaulle Airport and was allowed to leave the hotel 1 hour per day. And it was monitored. Meals brought in, and then flew the return flight back to the United States. And the reason for doing that was to avoid the 14-day quarantine. You were allowed to fly out of France without 14 days, and then you're allowed to come back in the States without the 14 days because you stay in that hotel. Now, that's only 2 days, and I know it was a little bit of a challenge for 2 days. What you just outlined could be 20 to close to 30 days. That, to me, would be much more of a non-starter for a lot of players than not being able to bring my entourage.
Exactly. I mean, again, if you're 25 years old and you're ranked number 75 and it's been a rough year, you're willing to put up with that? If you're Serena Williams, are you spending 3 weeks at an airport hotel? I mean, again, you mentioned the pilot. I mean, I think the whole food and beverage is going to be really interesting. Hydration and nutrition are very important to professional athletes. I had heard at one point, I had heard there might not be any sort of hospitality on the grounds. I think they're coming off of that. But what is the food and beverage situation?
Yeah.
You want to be dependent on airport hotel room service while you're trying to win a major? So again, it's going to be very interesting.
Yeah, and I'm chuckling only. I mean, look, he's a great champion, but I'm just trying to think of Novak ordering off the room service menu, looking for those proper gluten-free dishes. And
you right, you want mashed potatoes or fries with that, sir?
yeah.
Again, there's a documentary in there somewhere.
Yeah, you did a great podcast a couple of weeks ago with Dr. Brian Heinlein, who actually was a classmate of mine in college, who's a college tennis player. And that was terrific, John, because that was the first sign that I had that allowed me to feel cautiously optimistic, I think was the word Brian used, or guardedly optimistic about getting sports back. And of course, he has a great tennis background and and now is working with the NCAA and the colleges about trying to make sure that college football, first of all, can come back safely. It's the obvious caveat to all of this. But I thought that was wonderful. And given his experience with tennis, having been around the US Open forever, his input, his guidance, the concept that I've heard about even using suites in Ash Stadium, for players, so that you don't have, because this is the concept, I know I've talked about this in college football, there's no way you're going to have 100 players in a locker room together. This is no shot of that happening. When I heard you talk about that with Brian Heinlein a couple of weeks ago, that was the first time I felt like this has got a real chance to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think also, he has a duty and liability. He's not. I don't just say this because he's a classmate. This is not a someone who's going to be cavalier with this kind of information. We've all kind of turned into I say amateur virologists, right? Everyone has an idea of what's advisable and what isn't, and what's risky behavior. He really speaks with a science background and with a sports science background. And I think you're right. I mean, this was a few weeks ago. I've heard that suite scenario was actually that's going to happen. That it might not happen to every player in the draw, but the seeded players will have their own luxury suite, and they're not showers there, but they can stretch out and they can hydrate and they can have a little quiet space before their matches. Yeah, you're not going to have 128 players milling around one locker room. They're going to use that. I mean, the other thing too, I think bears mention, is with no fans and no hospitality and no indoor facilities that are being used for catering, there's actually a fairly big footprint. I mean, they can really use the entire grounds for these 256 players. It's very easy to see how they can have, enforce social distancing when basically the entire complex is only going to be the players playing every other day, their one entourage member, and a very skeletal. I mean, I'm hearing no media. I'm hearing very skeletal TV presence. You're not going to have food courts and ushers. I mean, they're going to use every inch of that facility, from what I understand.
Yeah, John, and that all makes great sense. And as you're outlining that, I'm thinking about Tim Henman's quote back in April regarding Wimbledon's decision to cancel, saying Wimbledon's study, the club's study, was that they needed 5,000 people on site to conduct the championships closed. Right. And that, I think, included all of the draws that may not take place, juniors, all the doubles, wheelchairs, et cetera, plus a full worldwide television presence. I would assume the USTA and the French Federation for Roland Garros have got to, I don't know if you can have that number. I'm not sure what the number is. You still need a substantial number of people on site, even closed, but I can't fathom 5,000 is going to work.
That sounds awfully high. I mean, I think that the number I saw was 900 for a regular NBA game that they're paring down. But, I mean, again, you take media out, you're going to have to, you're not going to have ushers and food courts. And I mean, it's going to be a very skeletal staff, from what I understand. And, that also you think about the USTA and the bottom line here, ESPN's contra, and I think we have to talk about ESPN's role in all this, right? I mean, if there is not TV, I mean, there's not going to be a dime from ticket sales. There's not going to be any of the hospitality and the suites and the usual sort of elbow rubbing scene there. This is all being driven by media rights. Maybe a little sponsorship, maybe there'll be a Chase banner behind the baseline, but this is really about ESPN's $80+ million. And that will more than cover prize money. That will yield a little bit of profit. It's not going to be nearly what it was in 2019. But if ESPN tomorrow said, you know what, college football is coming back. We haven't had live sports in a while. We're not comfortable with the health and safety. This whole idea that we've been talking about goes away. So, I mean, I think we ought to acknowledge at some point this is really very much driven by TV here, which is fine. I mean, TV pays the bills, but if ESPN didn't want this, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
No question, John. And I'm living through this right now, for example, in another realm, because yes, ESPN is a major presence in the sports television world that time of year. Right. That the NBA, which now seems to be settling into a schedule plan. The NHL is still looming with its schedule plan. Major League Baseball is a complete unknown. And right now, a lot of sports are being held up. Scheduling is being held up because ESPN wants to know, and the other major sports networks that aren't involved in tennis want to know who's playing and when are they playing. So, for example, college football right now is scheduling has been delayed because ESPN, which runs college football, but they need to know what the other sports are doing. And so where they jigsaw puzzle all of their programming pieces in. So it's all part of, and it goes back to why I get so frustrated about this entourage question is because calendars have to get thrown out now, right? We're going to have, the Indianapolis 500 could get pushed back, I think, into possibly November now. The Derby and the Preakness are being run in the fall. The Masters is being played. The US Open. I mean, everything's being pushed back. Everybody needs to be adaptable.
I wonder, I mean, the one thing I worry about with tennis is that, and, to the NBA to some extent as well, but, that we saw these UFC fights and it's one night only. And, even the Masters is 4 rounds. If day 3, there are a couple of positive COVID tests, and you've got 11 days left of this tournament, what do you do here? And I think if we're talking about, I mean, the NBA is sort of that's a different set of issues, but in theory, you could send a player home. You've got whatever. I mean, as we're recording, I think it's 22 teams are going to be there, and 10 are going home. I just think a 14-day minimum. I mean, this could be much more. I mean, if Cincinnati gets piggybacked, we're talking about 25 days. At a minimum, a 14, 15-day tennis event with individual sport athletes is much different from here's the day of the Indy 500. And once the race is over, everybody goes home. So it's, you really, if this thing does happen, you really cross your fingers for a variety of reasons that there are a minimum number of health concerns.
Absolutely. And as you said, in tennis, for example, if a player were to reach the quarterfinals and then show up for the practice day in between and test positive, right? I mean, there's so many, the assumption of risk to me is obvious, right? Any comeback, opening restaurants, opening hair salons, when that happens, gyms, all of it, it's all going to come with the assumption of risk. I thought this was fascinating, John, that I saved this from over the weekend here in the San Francisco Bay Area where I live. There's a fairly prominent high school football coach talking about the resumption of football this fall. And he said, to play football in the fall, as a society, we need to get comfortable with the fact that for most of the population, this is not a deadly virus. Depending on what stat you look at, it's 99-something%. For it to happen in the fall, people need to get comfortable with giving the choice to have kids get back to athletics. Kids being a specific reference in his world to high schools football. Right. But is that a concept that I think we all have to get comfortable with? There is going to be some risk, but again, the data proving that the participant pool, the risk is dramatically low.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of the discussion about colleges and universities. And if I have an 18-year-old, and I'm one of the small slivers of silver lining is, unlike other pandemics, that this seems to affect young people the least. That said, every tennis player has parents and family back home, and they may be 21, 22, 23, but their coaches may be twice that age. The same way a lot of these schools are saying, it's not the kids I worry about, it's the professors. If we can get comfortable with 18-year-olds, but the 18-year-olds interact with people who are much higher risk. And, the 18-year-olds have parents and grandparents. And if you could just cordon off the young athletes. I mean, I don't know if you saw I'm blanking on the Mike Gundy's quote, but the Oklahoma State said, listen, we got to get these guys, they're young kids, they're in their physical primes, and we got to get some money sloshing through the state. Maybe not the most tasteful comment, but the other thing about those 18 and 19-year-olds, they may not be at risk, but they certainly interact with people that are. And they have not just parents and grandparents, there's someone across the counter at the subway where they're getting lunch. So it's not just, it's not just like we can cordon off high risk and low risk here.
Yeah. Hey, one other thing, John, since we last spoke, I've learned, which was sad, that what we thought was going to be this great opportunity for a lot of American tennis players may change, because Oracle's changing its investments, and the Oracle Challenger Tour, as it was known, is not going to be anymore. Right. Now, the events may still take place as challengers, but Oracle's support of them is what's no longer going to take place, and that is largely tied to the untimely death of Mark Hurd, who was a college tennis player, great supporter, just fabulous supporter of tennis. And so I was taken by that. I just found this out, and boy, what I thought would be a wonderful outcome from the pandemic, which would be to have, in essence, regional tennis tours. Do we have an American tennis tour or European tennis tour, eventually an Asian tour? You're still going to have your December/January in Australia for now, but to restrict travel and therefore allow more people the opportunity. Does that resonate with you? Is it a big loss to have the loss of Oracle from this series of events?
Yeah, I mean, Oracle was a real, and Mark Hurd, you're right, deserves a special name check. This was a real sort of benefactor of tennis in the U.S. I mean, the regional tour idea, it's been bandied around before. I mean, I think some of it is, if you're in the U.S., don't you kind of want that there's not an American in the top 10? Don't you kind of want to see the best? And the other thing, I think some of it is media and sponsorship and then selling TV. And so some of it also is, what do you do about Alex Divio? What do you do about Nick Kyrgios, who's maybe based in Florida those few months? I just, I think the sport's great. It's terrible during COVID. I mean, the sport's great asset is that it's global, and it's like a mini Olympics at every event. And you have, we think nothing of watching a Brazilian play a Czech in Tokyo. I think something would be lost if we went to this regional model. And I can't help but thinking fans want to see the best, and they don't want to see, everybody comes here for the PGA Tour, which, selfishly, that might be ideal if all the tennis events were between Hawaii and in Florida, and everybody came to the U.S. It'd be great for us. I don't know how fair that would be for the rest of the world. I just don't think at this point, given every trend of globalization and global business and technology, regional tours seems kind of retro. I'm not sure we would be willing to go back to that. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I mean, what I thought, John, and this would require the one thing that tennis has so sorely lacked, which is cooperation, would be you would have both. You would have regional tours that augment the major events, which right now we have 4 slams and you have 9 masters. And in theory, if the tours merge, those 9 events become your 9 combined events. And now you
Right.
have 13 big events, right?
Right.
But rather than globe trotting for the lower ranked events, the 250s or the equivalent on the WTA tour, whatever label they put on them, those would be your regional events. It's conceptual. I'm not smart enough to know how to apply it in real world, but to me, it comes off with the PGA Tour, because the vast majority of the PGA Tour players are American.
Right.
And there are other tours in other continents for players who can't qualify or don't have the means to play the PGA Tour. That, to me, somewhere down the line, if we're going to continue to face these travel issues, is something I would hope tennis would look at, study its feasibility.
Yeah, I mean, I remember talking about this with Mark Miles years ago, who basically said, I don't think it ended up as something that they went particularly far down the road on, but it was sort of like you'd have an Americas, you'd have Europe, you'd have Asia and Australia, and everybody would get together at the majors. And you could sell your own TV deals, and all the people would say, where are all the American players? Well, you know what? We're going to familiarize you with the American players. I mean, I think the decision was probably made as a global tour. It's better if flying is an issue. What's the difference between New York, London right now and New York, LA? I mean, if you can't get on a plane, you can't get on a plane. But, if you're flying from New York to Sao Paulo, you may as well fly from New York to Paris. But I think one thing about this whole pandemic is we've really seen, we've learned a lot about tennis, and we've seen how much the sport is dependent on media rights. We've seen how some events are so different from others, how some players live so differently from others. It's the same income inequality that affects so many societies certainly is present in tennis as well. I mean, I feel like we've learned an awful lot about how the sport goes about its business, for better or worse.
So, John, maybe a good place to finish. If I were to say, of all the hours I've spent, like a lot of people of our ilk in the last couple of weeks, listening, rabbit hole nights to try to just listen. As shining a moment as I've heard, this from a 16-year-old. Coco Gauff's 2.5 minutes in Delray Beach was just breathtaking. And the poise and the maturity, God, we all remember when we were 16. Could any of us have had any ability to come close to the way she spoke in that? I think it was about 2.5 minutes.
Right. Someone made a good point to me too. They said, when you're a kid, you imagine yourself giving the winner's speech when you win Wimbledon. Like, there are certain moments where you can envision it. I suspect Coco Gauff did not prepare for a moment like this. I mean, authenticity is one of these words that gets overused, but that was really from the heart, and that's not the kind of speech that was off the cuff. That's not the kind of thing that you've pre-scripted for years and years and you're ready to unleash. And I think she's one of the many players who really has distinguished. I mean, she was born March of 2004. So that's a high school. So we forget that. And part of it is the way she composes herself. And part of it, this is a player who's been in the top 50 already. This is someone who should be a high school sophomore. So, if we're looking for plenty of ugliness these last 120 days, but there's also been some real beams of bright light, and that was one of them.